Starting in 1989, I began through the institution that I founded, IPCRI, which was then called the Israel-Palestina Center for Research Information, began bringing together groups of Israelis and Palestinians from the establishment of both sides to figure out how to create a two-state solution. We started with 3 working groups in 1989, one of economic experts, one of Jerusalem experts, and one on water experts. And these working groups expanded, having closed-room meetings once a month of each one of these working groups, introducing Israelis and Palestinians to each other, who were all affiliated to the governments, to the officials on both sides. In 1992, understanding that any progress that needed to be made was going to be in the area of security understanding. I proposed to the Palestinian leadership that we try to convene a meeting of Israeli and Palestinian security experts. And we got the agreement. There were all kinds of problems in organizing this meeting, but in October of 1992, we spent 3 days in London with a high-level group of Israeli security experts and Palestinian security experts. One of the experts came from Tunis, from Arafat's office, and 3 or 4 times a day he was on the phone back to Arafat, getting input and information and approvals for the discussions that went on. Following the meeting, one of the members of the Israeli team went and reported directly back to Rabin about the meeting. Rabin was prime minister then. What we were told by the person who was the former chief of staff of the Israeli army, Motte Gor, is that Rabin based his agreement to enter into the secret talks in Oslo on the understandings that were reached at the security meeting. The subjects that were dealt with at the security meeting in 1992 were primarily related to whether or not the Palestinians would be able to take over territories if Israel withdrew and guaranteed that they would fight against terrorism from those territories. We also discussed the principle of prisoner releases, and when Oslo was signed, most of the Palestinian Authority that was created were Palestinians from Fatah who were in prison in Israel or were deported by Israel, and they came back and formed the core of the Palestinian Authority with Arafat, and we talked about the return of Arafat to the territories also. So all these main subjects were talked about: the size of the Palestinian security forces, the nature of security cooperation. So this really laid a foundation stone. When the secret talks were going on in Oslo, I didn't know about them. I had suspicions that something was going on because the people who were running the talks were people that I was in contact with. They were friends and colleagues. So I had suspicions, but I didn't have any real knowledge of it. Sometime just after Oslo was signed, I was contacted by an intelligence officer who was working for Rabin and wanted to meet me. And soon afterwards, we met, and I learned that Rabin had created a secret team of intelligence officers to advise him on the peace process. And over the next 2 years, more or less, from 94 until 96, I spent about 200 hours advising this team that was set up to advise Rabin on the peace process. So that was a major role that I played with my fingerprints all over what was going on in advising directly to the Prime Minister of what I thought he should be doing or what he shouldn't be doing and how to advance the peace process. Well, those were in the early years. The whole problem that we face today is that over 22 years of peace processes, we have a failed process, which meant that the parties signed agreements and then didn't implement them. Both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, took upon themselves obligations that they didn't then implement. Part of it was because of the inability to foresee things that would happen and unfold as time went on that made it difficult to implement. Part of it was because of failures of the agreements themselves, of not being good agreements. Part of it was in the concept that was the basis of Oslo was that we need to work together over time in order to build trust. And once we build trust, we would be more capable to negotiate the permanent status issues. So the interim agreement, which didn't deal with any of the permanent status issues, Palestinian statehood, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, none of these core issues were dealt with during the time when it was thought that if we begin to work together, we begin to implement what we agreed on, we would develop trust over time, and that would make it easier or possible to negotiate the difficult issues. The problem is that the process failed, and the trust didn't develop. What developed instead was mistrust. So the two parties didn't trust each other, they mistrusted each other, and the non-implementation of the agreements led to situations that were no longer sustainable of keeping relations peaceful and quiet. The basic rationale of Oslo was that Israel would withdraw from territories that would be turned over to the Palestinian Authority, who would create the institutional state, who would take over responsible government, including fighting against violence and terrorism, and there we would be able to negotiate a border in Jerusalem and all these permanent status issues. But as Palestinian violence emerged, the Israelis withheld their obligations to withdraw from territories, and the Palestinians began to question the whole logic about fighting terrorism if Israel's not withdrawing. After Rabin was assassinated and then Netanyahu was elected, and the peace process failed, frozen completely by Netanyahu, and Israel continued to build more settlements, the Palestinians began questioning whether or not what they're doing is in fact protecting the occupation and protecting the settlers. The Israelis responded negatively to Palestinian violence by freezing their side of the agreement, and there was no mechanism built into the agreements to deal with breaches and disputes. So one dispute and one breach got put on another, and we had this process that spun out of control that eventually led to the Second Intifada. With the terrorism of the Second Intifada, then the Israeli reinvasion of the occupied territories, and the whole thing failed. And the publics on both sides lost confidence that peace is possible. Everyone wants peace, they just don't believe it's possible. They don't believe there's a partner, a serious partner on the other side for achieving peace. And that explains more or less what we have today. It's not that Israelis and Palestinians don't want peace, they do. They just don't know how it's possible with people on the other side who don't implement their obligations. And neither side looks objectively and said, here's a process that went bad, let's try and figure it out and make it better. And both sides blame the other side for the failure and take no responsibility on themselves. It's both and it's more than that. The wall made it a lot more difficult for suicide bombers to get into Israel. And that was its purpose. The wall's security purpose was to make it difficult for them to get in, to cross into Israel, to be able to blow themselves in. So the wall makes it more difficult. And the wall, there's no doubt that it's an obstacle. It's not impossible for someone who wants to get in. They can find a way to get in. But it's a lot more difficult. And the difficulties create situations where the Israeli intelligence has more time and more ability to capture those people who are trying to get in, who are organizing themselves. It's also true that there was a Palestinian political decision to no longer give support to suicide bombers. Even though I would say between 20% and 30% of Palestinian society still supports the basic idea of suicide bombers in Israel, the Palestinian Authority itself and their security forces are fighting against them. And there were agreements made between Israel and the Palestinians with regard to removing people from the wanted list, from rehabilitating people who were fugitives, who were armed, militia, Al-Aqsa brigades and others, and of course the dedication of the Palestinian Authority to fight against Hamas and Islamic Jihad is all part of it. So it's a combination of things. No one can say it's just this one thing. There's no question that the wall is a factor that provides greater security for Israel. But it's not the only factor. If Palestinians still wanted to attack Israel, they could do it, and of course the wall doesn't stop rocking. I think it's possible to reach an agreement if we were to deal with all the issues logically and rationally. The problem is not finding the solutions. We know what the solutions are. The question is whether or not there's political will to make those decisions. I think on the Palestinian side there is, on the point of view of the leadership, and on the Israeli side there is not. That may change as a result of massive international pressure that's now going to come to bear on Israel. If there's a will to make an agreement, there are ways to make an agreement. And partnership is something which has to be built over time. It's not something that exists by itself. And today we should be a lot more knowledgeable about how to make what I call an intelligent agreement, a careful agreement. An agreement which is based on mistrust, not based on trust. An agreement which is based on performance, of setting benchmarks, of setting all kinds of measurements of risk management, so that unnecessary risks are not taken before we're sure that both sides are in fact going to implement what they say they're going to do. We have to empower the parties to do the negotiations, not a third party. I don't believe in third party mediation here. It really has to be Israelis and Palestinians sitting together in a room face to face without an American mediator or a European mediator. It really has to be them doing it. It has to be out of a decision that we need to change the relationship. And then the agreements have to be done in a way that allows implementation to take over a relatively long period of time. Even once we have an agreement, the implementation is not going to be within a year or 2 years or 3 years. It will take longer. And it has to be based on building mechanisms of cooperation across the borders. We have to get rid of this concept that peace is a divorce, where we're here and they're there, and we have walls and fences between us. That is not sustainable. Peace has to be built based on building relations between peoples who can cross borders, work together, cooperate together, learn together, study each other, appreciate each other, learn to know each other. That's how peace has to be built. We're talking mainly about the West Bank. We have no territorial dispute with regard to Gaza. Israel left Gaza. The problem in Gaza is, of course, that a regime controls Gaza that's not willing to make peace with Israel. So therefore, my proposal would be that Gaza is part of the Palestinian state and part of the agreement, but it says that it won't be implemented in Gaza until the regime that controls Gaza accepts the terms of the agreement. That means that whoever's in charge of Gaza, if they want Gaza to be part of the Palestinian state, they want Gaza to be open to the world, they want Gaza to be a normal place where people can move to the West Bank, to Israel, to the rest of the world, that the regime that controls Gaza has to accept the terms of the agreement, which means peace with Israel and recognition of Israel, and that the Palestinian state be a demilitarized state. So we have to get rid of the arms and the rockets in Gaza, and there needs to be international supervision of the decommissioning of weapons in Gaza. But what that will do will throw the ball in the Gaza court and say to the people in Gaza, the 1.8 million people there, if you want to be part of peace, you want to be part of prosperity, you want to live as part of this world, you have to either convince the regime that controls you to accept the agreement, or you have to get rid of that regime. And then I think we're giving the tools to the people in Gaza to be empowered. We could also empower the region, because if Israel were to accept this kind of agreement, then basically what we have is Israel accepting the Arab Peace Initiative. And in the framework of the Arab Peace Initiative, we could call on the Arab League, the moderate Sunni states, who are now gathering together to fight extremism in Yemen, and say to them, we want an Arab-led multinational force to come into Gaza, to stabilize Gaza, to securitize Gaza, to make it part of the Palestinian state. That force would include forces from the Palestinian Authority, but it would be accepted by the people of Gaza, because the end result would be that they would benefit by living in an open Gaza with peace.
It seems that Gaza is always a good excuse for those who
right, but it shouldn't be, because nothing will change in Gaza until there is an alternative for the people in Gaza to grab onto. So we need to do is provide them with that alternative and say, okay, nothing's going to change unless you change the situation in Gaza. And then it becomes, as Abu Mazen once said to me, what you have to do, Israelis have to do, is make Hamas my problem, not your problem. And he's right. Hamas has to be the Palestinian problem, not the Israeli problem. We're not going to have the political will in Israel voluntarily. It's only going to come after there's massive international pressure on Israel. I think that once the international community is refocused on Palestine, which it will sometime after they finish dealing with the Iranian issue, there are going to be both civil society and governmental calls for sanctions on Israel. The first aspect of it might be, I don't know if it's going to happen, but it might be the removal of the American political umbrella for Israel in international forums like the United Nations Security Council. The Palestinians are going to be resubmitting a resolution to the Security Council to set parameters for the negotiations between Israel and Palestine, to set a deadline for ending the occupation, and for acceptance of Palestine as a member state of the United Nations. It failed in the past because the United States vetoed it. And because of the conflicts that's developing between the White House and Jerusalem, we might have a situation where the U.S. government no longer uses its veto to protect Israel. We saw last week in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, where 3 resolutions supporting Palestine passed, and the Americans weren't even present. They didn't show up for the meeting. The Israelis claim was part of their strategy to remove any importance from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, but a non-American presence sends a very clear message, not only that they were following Israel's line of not being there, but they're not providing this umbrella of protection for Israel. So I think we're going to see that. We're going to see European Union policies with regard to settlement products, with regard to the non-allowance of entry of settlers who are considered violent. And I could see the Europeans sometime down the road of removing their visa-free access process for Israeli citizens who travel in Europe. Today, people who hold an Israeli passport don't need a visa to go to Europe. I could see that being removed. This is something that's possible, and there are other things that could happen. Civil society boycotts and sanctions, cultural boycotts and sanctions, that have all begun over the last years, but hasn't had a real impact. If there's a concerted world effort against the occupation and against Israel's settlement policies, I think we'll see a big change. I think that the Palestinians are going to take Israel to the International Criminal Court in The Hague on the issue of settlements, on the illegality of settlements. And if the government of Israel, which it's likely to do, continues to build settlements, Israel is going to see a massive international response against anti-Semitism. That's going to be the knee-jerk reaction of Israel and the Jewish establishment around the world, who are going to say it's nothing about Israel's policies, it's all about anti-Semitism. They hate the Jews. But that's going to backfire, because it's not anti-Semitism. Some of it might be, but most of it is against what Israel's doing. The point that I make is that 28 member states of the European Union support Israel, support Israel's right to exist, support Israel's legitimacy. They're opposed to Israel's policies in the occupied territories. They're opposed to Israel denying the Palestinians the right of self-determination. They're opposed to settlements. And at some point or another, when the pressure bears down on the Israeli public, and Israelis feel it in their pockets, and Israelis are not welcome around the world as they travel, and Israelis love to travel, it will begin to have an impact. It won't be fast, but it will happen. And with all the differences, the best example in the world of this is South Africa. What happened in South Africa, what broke apartheid, was the international pressure on South Africa. Well, what Israel needs to do is conduct negotiations with the Palestinians on the two-state solution. We all know what the agreement looks like, but that's not going to happen. The people of Gaza are not going to revolt against their leadership unless they have a real alternative that they can grab onto, because they have nothing to replace Hamas with now that's going to provide them with anything that's significantly better. They're not going to take the risks of fighting Hamas where there's no political horizon after defeating Hamas. So this has to be part of a larger process. What's going to force Israel to do it? Just as I said, the international pressure. Nothing of significance. And there could be civil society reaching across the border, Facebook kind of groups and things like that, but it won't have a deep impact. It's 1.8 million people in Gaza living without hope. Some Facebook chats are not going to change that. No, I think that Palestinians have to be very, very careful not to allow violence to reemerge. Palestinians are on the road to victory if they manage to control violence. The only way that they will lose now, as I foresee in the future in terms of the international community support they're getting, is if they revert to violence. They have to be very careful about that. And there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anger in Palestine, both in the West Bank and Gaza. And their biggest enemy will be if they go back to violence, because they will lose the support of the international community if they go back to blowing up buses and cafes and things like that. They have to stick to a nonviolent strategy. The diplomatic strategy supported and led by Abu Mazen is their best way forward. It's not a quick strategy, but it's the best way that they have of winning.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.